The interrogation report arrived at 3rd Army G2 headquarters at 7:22 in the morning on November 9th, 1944. For pages typed in the clipped clinical language that military intelligence officers use when they're trying to record something accurately and not let their personal reaction to what they are recording show up in the document. The report covered the previous day's interrogation of a captured Waffen-SS officer being held at a forward processing point in Lorraine, France. The officer had been cooperative on tactical questions, unit positions, strength estimates, supply lines, standard interrogation output. And then, at the bottom of page 3, the reporting officer had typed a verbatim quote. The SS officer had looked at the American captain conducting the interrogation and said, in German, which the interpreter translated word for word and the reporting officer typed word for word, "American tanks are toys. The boys who drive them are frightened. We will break them the way a child breaks a toy." The reporting officer had underlined it. Not standard procedure. He underlined it because he wanted whoever read this report next to understand that this was not paraphrase, not summary, not interpretation. This was what the man had actually said, sitting in an American holding facility 3 days after his capture, still wearing his Waffen-SS uniform, looking at an American officer across the table and saying it out loud. The report went to G2. G2 sent it to Patton. And what Patton did next is the reason this story exists. But to understand what he did, you have to first understand something that almost nobody knows about this story. Something that makes the SS Colonel's statement much more uncomfortable than it first appears. Subscribe. This channel exists to keep stories like this alive. The SS officer's name was Karl Heinrich Brenner. He was 38 years old, from Cologne, Germany. He had joined the Waffen-SS in 1938 and had fought on the Eastern Front from 1941 through 1943 before transfer to the Western Theater. He held the rank of Obersturmbannführer, equivalent to lieutenant colonel, and had commanded a tank unit equipped with Tiger I heavy tanks in the Lorraine sector before his capture on November 6, 1944. He was, in other words, a man who had spent years inside German armor, who understood the mechanical and tactical realities of German heavy tanks, and who had spent the preceding months watching American Sherman tanks attempt to engage Tiger is in direct combat in the fields of northeastern France. He was not speaking from ignorance. He was speaking from experience. And this is the part that makes the report uncomfortable to read, because Karl Heinrich Brenner was not entirely wrong. The Sherman M4 medium tank, the workhorse of Patton's 3rd Army, the tank that tens of thousands of American crewmen lived and fought, and in many cases died inside, was by the technical specifications that govern armored combat, significantly inferior to the German Tiger I. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate Tiger armor at standard combat ranges. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's own ammunition was still bouncing off. The frontal armor of a Sherman was 50mm thick. The frontal armor of a Tiger was more than 100mm. These are not contested numbers. They are the documented specifications of both vehicles. By January of 1945, the American press had published them. Hanson Baldwin of the New York Times wrote about it. The Washington Post editorial board demanded a congressional investigation. The story reached Europe. American tankers read it in the newspapers that came to the front. And General Patton, who understood the Sherman's limitations better than most people in the American command, gave a press conference in March of 1945 and publicly defended the tank, and then wrote a private letter to Lieutenant General Thomas T. Handy, Deputy Chief of Staff, that the War Department released to the American press, in which Patton acknowledged in writing that the Sherman would not last in a head-on slugging match against the Tiger. He acknowledged it because it was true. The SS colonel in the holding facility in Lorraine, with his Tiger experience and his contempt for American armor, was looking at the same technical reality that Patton himself had acknowledged in a letter. The toy statement was wrong about the boys. It was not entirely wrong about the toys. See, what most people don't realize is that this is what made the interrogation report so important when it reached Patton's desk. Not because an arrogant SS officer had said something offensive. Arrogant SS officers said offensive things regularly. It was important because the SS officer had said something that touched the central morale problem that Patton was managing in November of 1944. American tankers knew their tanks were outgunned. They had known it since Normandy. They had fought in Shermans that caught fire when hit, that were destroyed at ranges where they could not effectively return fire, that required multiple vehicles to defeat a single Tiger or Panther. The casualties were documented. Third Army records show 1,136 tank casualties between August 1st and the end of 1944. The men who drove those tanks read newspapers. They heard what people back home were saying about the machines they lived inside. And now, in the holding facility in Lorraine, an SS officer had looked an American captain in the eye and said what some of those men feared their enemy actually believed about them. Toys. Frightened boys. Patton read it. He understood what it was and what it could do if it moved from an interrogation report into the conversation his soldiers were already having. Here is where it gets serious. Because on October 28, 1944, 12 days before that interrogation report landed on Patton's desk, he had done something that nobody who reads this story about the SS colonel's statement expects. He had climbed onto the hood of an armored car in the Lorraine countryside and delivered a speech to a tank battalion that was about to enter combat for the first time. The battalion was the 761st Tank Battalion. Their nickname was the Black Panthers. They were the first African-American armored unit in the history of the United States Army to be committed to combat. They had arrived in France at Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. They had covered 400 miles in 6 days across France to catch up with the Third Army. Patton had specifically requested them. And on October 28th, standing on the hood of that armored car with his ivory-handled pistols and his polished helmet, he said to them, in his curiously high-pitched voice, the words that are now in the historical record, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Krautson softbitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down. And damn you, don't let me down." The tanks those men drove were M4 Shermans. The same toys. The same machines. Patton had sent 760 black men into combat in the vehicles that an SS colonel would 11 days later describe as toys driven by frightened boys. Think about that for a moment. And then think about what happened on November 7th, 1944. 9 days after Patton's speech, 2 days before the interrogation report arrived, when the 761st entered combat for the first time in the French town of Morville-les-Vic in what one officer present described as an inferno of battle. They took the town. They kept moving. They did not stop. Now I need to tell you about a specific man. Because the interrogation report and the SS colonel and Patton's response to both of them only carry their full weight once you know who was inside one of those Sherman tanks in the fields of northeastern France in November of 1944. His name was Ruben Rivers. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, 26 years old, from Tecumseh, Oklahoma, a small town in the southern part of the state, farm country, the kind of place where a man grows up understanding that the land requires physical work, and that physical work requires that you stay when it gets hard. He had joined the Army in January of 1942. He had trained for nearly 3 years at Camp Hood, Texas. He had shipped out from New York City on August 27, 1944, on a vessel called the Esperance Bay, and had landed at Omaha Beach on October 10th. He was assigned to Company A of the 761st Tank Battalion. He drove a Sherman. On November 8, 1944, one day after the 761 SD's first combat at Morville-les-Vic, Company A attacked the French town of Vic-sur-Seille. There was a roadblock, felled trees across the road, landmines embedded in the approach. American tanks and infantry were pinned. The attack was stalling. Staff Sergeant Rivers dismounted from a Sherman. Under direct enemy fire, small arms, artillery, everything the German defenders had pointed at that road, he attached a cable to the felled tree that was blocking the column. He moved it off the road, by himself, under fire, so the column could advance. Bear with me. November 9th, 1944. The 761st took Chateau Salins after a 4-hour fight in the first snowstorm of the season. 9 of the battalion's enlisted soldiers were killed that day. November 12th, Company A repulsed a German counterattack near Weiss and destroyed 2 enemy tanks. November 16th, 1944. The target was Gebling, France. Rivers and Company A moved toward the town. His Sherman hit a landmine at a railroad crossing. The explosion slashed his leg to the bone. The medics came. The morphine needle came. Rivers refused it. The evacuation order came. Rivers refused it. Captain David Williams, 31 years old, commanding officer of Company A, told Rivers he was being evacuated. Rivers said no. He transferred to another Sherman. He went forward into Gebling. The citation that would eventually be written for what happened over the following 3 days. The citation that would be recommended on the day after Rivers' death by Captain Williams, who had watched every hour of what the man in that Sherman did on one leg without morphine, uses the words conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. What those words describe: November 17th, moving through Gebling, directing fire, engaging German armor, staying forward. November 18th, Captain Williams found Rivers still in his tank, still in action. Williams ordered him evacuated again. Rivers said, "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough." November 19th, 1944. Company A advanced toward the town of Borgeltoff. Enemy fire stopped the column. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers spotted the enemy position and opened fire, allowing the rest of the company to advance to cover. He was killed in action in that exchange. He was 26 years old. He was buried at the Lorraine American Cemetery in France, Plot C, Row 13, Grave 7. He is still there. Captain Williams submitted the Medal of Honor recommendation the following day. It was the correct thing to do, and it required no deliberation. Now let me tell you about the interrogation room. Because Patton read the G2 report on the morning of November 9th, 1944, the same morning the 761st was fighting through Chateau Salins in the first snowstorm. The same morning Staff Sergeant Rivers was somewhere in northeastern France in a Sherman tank. Patton read the 4 pages. He read the underlined sentence at the bottom of page 3. American tanks are toys. The boys who drive them are frightened. We will break them the way a child breaks a toy. He read it twice. He set the report on his desk. He did not call anyone in. He did not dictate a response immediately. His aide, Captain Charles Codman, 51 years old, from Boston, Massachusetts, was in the outer office. He heard nothing from Patton's side for approximately 20 minutes. Then Patton called him in. He said, "Give me the 761 SDS action report from yesterday." Codman brought it. Patton read it. Then he picked up a pen and wrote 3 things on the G2 report. The first was a note to the G2 officer who had typed the underlined sentence. It said, "Good, keep it." The second was a directive to the interrogating officer. It said, "Tell him to look out his window." The holding facility where Brenner was being processed had a view, partial, obstructed, but a view, of a road that Allied supply and combat vehicles used regularly. What Brenner would see from that window was American equipment moving. Shermans, the toys, moving in volume, in organized columns, in the quantities that the German logistics system had not been able to match since the Normandy breakout. Numbers that no Tiger could account for, regardless of what a Tiger's 88 millimeters could do to a Sherman's armor. The third thing Patton wrote was not a directive. It was a single sentence added at the bottom of the G2 report in his own handwriting. It read, "The answer to his statement is already in the field. Send him the 761 SDS action summary for November 8th. That sentence is in the 3rd Army G2 records in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It has been there since the records were processed after the war." The handwriting is Patton's. The interrogating officer delivered Patton's response to Brenner that afternoon. What Brenner said when he read the 761 SD's November 8th action summary. The account of the men who had taken Vic-sur-Seille, who had cleared the roadblock, who had fought through Chateau Salins, is not recorded in the interrogation log. The log notes that the summary was delivered and received. It does not record a verbal response. There was apparently none. Here is what came next. Not the outcome Brenner expected, and not the outcome that the simple version of this story provides. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was killed on November 19, 1944. Captain Williams submitted the Medal of Honor recommendation the following day. The Army reviewed it. The Army processed it. And then the Army did not award it. Not in 1944. Not in 1945. Not in 1950. Not in 1960. Not in 1970. Captain Williams fought the Army bureaucracy for 20 years to have it recognized. He was not alone. Across the 761st, across all the African-American combat units of the Second World War, a pattern was documented in the post-war record. Black soldiers were systematically recommended for the Medal of Honor and systematically denied it. The discrimination was not in the citations. The citations were correct. It was in the processing. It was in the layers of the Army bureaucracy that reviewed, delayed, returned, and ultimately buried the recommendations. 7 black soldiers who served in the Second World War were eventually identified as having been denied the Medal of Honor through this systematic process. Ruben Rivers was one of them. The Army did not award Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers the Medal of Honor until January 12, 1997. 53 years after Captain Williams wrote the recommendation the day after Rivers died in a Sherman tank in a field in France. The ceremony was at the White House. President Clinton presided. Rivers' sister, Grace Woodfork, received the medal on behalf of her brother. She was elderly. She had waited her entire adult life. The citation read in part, Staff Sergeant Rivers declined an injection of morphine, refused to be evacuated, took command of another tank, and advanced with his company. Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Karl-Heinrich Brenner was repatriated to Germany in 1947 under the standard prisoner of war processing that followed the end of the war. He had been held in American custody for approximately 2.5 years. He was processed through the denazification proceedings that the Allied occupation authorities conducted for former Waffen-SS personnel. He returned to Cologne. He lived there. He died there. The date of his death is not in the documents that are publicly available. He left no recorded public statement about the 761st or about Staff Sergeant Rivers or about what he saw from the window of the holding facility when the Allied columns moved on the road outside. The interrogation log from November 8, 1944, is in the 3rd Army records. His statement, "American tanks are toys, the boys who drive them are frightened," is in it on page 3 underlined. Patton's response is at the bottom in handwriting. The answer to his statement is already in the field. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 consecutive days. They fought through 6 countries. They liberated 30 towns. They earned 391 decorations for heroism, 246 Purple Hearts, 7 Silver Stars, and 1 Medal of Honor, awarded 53 years late in a White House ceremony to a man who had been in the ground at the Lorraine American Cemetery since November 19, 1944. Plot C, Row 13, Grave 7, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, 26 years old, from Tecumseh, Oklahoma. He drove a Sherman. The toys, the frightened boys, 183 days, 30 towns, 53 years for a piece of metal and a piece of paper that said what the men who were there already knew from the first day. Patton's handwritten note is still in the National Archives. The ink has held. It says, the answer to his statement is already in the field. On November 7, 1944, the answer drove off Omaha Beach in Sherman tanks and went looking for the enemy. On November 16th, it refused morphine and took command of another tank. On November 19th, it opened fire on a German position to let the rest of the company reach cover and was killed doing it. The answer is buried in France. Plot C, Row 13, Grave 7. It has been there since 1944. It does not need anyone to underline it. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to know that the boys Brenner call frightened fought 183 days straight. Hit like if you believe Ruben Rivers deserved his medal before his sister was old enough to need help walking to the stage to receive it. The next story I'm going to tell you involves a document found in a German officer's headquarters in April of 1945, an order he had written and never sent, about what he planned to do with American prisoners, and what Patton's forces found when they opened the safe. It was locked inside. There is one more thing this story requires before it is complete. The Sherman tank debate, the controversy that the SS colonel's statement touched, and that Patton managed so carefully through the winter of 1944 and in 1945, had a specific human cost that the technical specifications and the press coverage and the congressional demands for investigation all described in the aggregate without ever quite reaching the specific. So let me give you the specific. Private First Class Horace Evans, 22 years old, from Montgomery, Alabama, joined the United States Army in March of 1943. He was assigned to an armored unit in the Third Army. He trained in Texas. He shipped to England. He came ashore at Normandy. He drove a Sherman. He was killed on November 18, 1944, near the town of Gebelling, France, when his Sherman was hit by German anti-tank fire. He was killed one day before Ruben Rivers was killed in the same operational area, in the same kind of vehicle, by the same category of weapon. He was 22 years old. His mother, Ida Evans, received the War Department telegram in Montgomery, Alabama, in late November of 1944. She had written to him every week since he deployed. His last letter home, postmarked November 3, 1944, said the weather had gotten cold and that he was doing all right. He said not to worry. He told her the food had improved. He said he figured the war would be over soon. He was dead 15 days after he wrote it. There were 1,136 tank casualties in the Third Army between August 1, 1944 and the end of that year. Each one of those is a number in a record. Each one of those numbers is also a letter home that said the weather had gotten cold, and do not worry, and I figure the war will be over soon. The SS colonel in the holding facility in Lorraine knew the technical specifications. He knew the 88 millimeters versus the 75 millimeters. He knew the armor thickness differentials. What he did not know, what the interrogation log does not suggest he ever considered, is that the gap between what a weapon does and what the man inside it does is not a mechanical question. It is not solved by comparing specifications on paper. It is solved, if it is solved at all, by what the man inside the vehicle decides to do when the situation requires a decision that the specification said should not be survivable. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers decided to take command of another tank after a mine slashed his leg to the bone. He made that decision 4 times over 4 days, in the same category of vehicle that the SS colonel had dismissed. He made it without morphine. He made it knowing the specifications as well as anyone. And he made it because the specifications were not the point. The point was the town in front of him and the men beside him, and the road that needed to be cleared, and the position that needed to be taken, and the company that needed to be able to advance. That is what the toys were driven by. That is what frightened means when you refuse the morphine and get back in the tank. Patton understood this. He had understood it since before the war. He wrote about it. He spoke about it. He had stood on the hood of an armored car on October 28, 1944, and said it to 760 men who were about to prove it. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut-Sansoff-bitches. He had said it knowing that the tanks they were about to drive were technically inferior to the best German armor. He had said it because he understood that what matters in a tank battle is not only the armor thickness. It is also what the man inside the armor decides. And he had, on the morning of November 9th, 1944, read an interrogation report that reduced that understanding to a contemptuous sentence about toys and frightened boys, and he had written at the bottom of it, in his own hand, the answer to his statement is already in the field. He had written it knowing exactly what was in the field. He had put it there himself, 11 days earlier, standing on that armored car hood with his pistols and his polished helmet, and his high-pitched voice telling men who had been told their entire lives that they were not equal, that he needed the best, and he would not have sent for them if they were not the best. The answer was in the field. The answer drove a Sherman. The answer refused the morphine 4 times. The answer is buried in France at the Lorraine American Cemetery, and it waited 53 years for the country that sent it there to write down on paper what it already was.